Hello, Houston. Just as a quick reminder, we're going to put on the screen what we were talking about last time. In order to get you up to speed from the previous tape, we were, whoops, and I've done it again. Give me just a second. We'll put on the whole screen what we want you to be seeing, which is this, and back it up a little bit. 1, 2, 3. There we go. And then as a reminder, that's what I was trying to show you that we were talking about at the end of the last hour, and we were just ready to move into one of the problems that we have in problem solving, and that is essentially functional fixedness. Dunker actually identified this as a problem with problem solving way back in 1945, and what it's really doing is responding to the question of what is the effect of experience on current problem solving. That is, to what extent does your history either limit or encourage you to find new ways to solve a particular problem. And he created a particularly interesting kind of situation with that, utilizing essentially essentially jars. And the situation that you were faced with is essentially that you were given, you have jars A, B, and C that are available to you, and an unlimited supply of water. And the challenge then was that can you use A, B, and C in order to create a particular quantity of water. So you were basically using A, B, and C, pouring back and forth among them to give you the following kind of end product as a solution. And so if you set about with doing that, and you look first at problem number 1 with 21, 127, and 3 as the gallon requirements, it becomes pretty obvious when you think about it a minute that if you fill the 127 gallon bucket and then pour it into 21, you use that water to fill number 21, or the 21 gallon bucket, and then fill the 3 gallon bucket twice. What you've done essentially is 127 minus 21 gives you 106, minus 3 is 103, minus 3 gives you your goal, the target, X for that problem, which was 100. And it turns out then, if you look at the second problem, which is 42, 9, and 6, the same general strategy actually works, so that you take the 42 gallon bucket, fill that, and then fill the A bucket once and the C bucket twice. You end up with 21 gallons remaining, which was your target. And by the third strategy, third problem, you're already pretty well convinced that, gee, this really works. 163 minus 14 minus 25 minus 25, and there we are at 99, which was our target. So at some point, it's finally going to occur to you that there is actually a formula. There is, I should say, actually a formula that will work to solve all this. And if you go back and look at it, yes, bucket B minus A minus the C bucket twice gives you the answer in each and every instance. So with the grin on your face, you barrel ahead and take the 43 gallon bucket, and without even thinking about it, you fill the B bucket once and the C bucket twice, and lo and behold, you've got 5 gallons left, which was your target in that particular situation. And then you do it with the next problem, the 59 gallon bucket poured into 20 and 4 twice, leaves you with 31, and so now you're absolutely convinced, and you take your massive 76 gallon bucket, pour it into the 28, and then fill the 3 twice, and you've still got way too much gallons left. All of a sudden, this magnificent B minus A minus 2C doesn't work. And that is the problem, because what's basically happened there is, if you look at that last problem, there is a much simpler formula that will work in that situation. That is, A minus C gives us X, which is covered by the UH insignia at the moment, but basically the correct answer that we're looking for there is 25 gallons. Can we remove the UH logo for just a moment there, please? And in essence, what we've got then is this kind of a solution, much easier. You still get an answer, and you're still going to get your feet wet pouring fluids back and forth. But in essence, what was demonstrated there essentially is that in the last problem, A minus C is a much quicker solution to that particular situation. And so it's this kind of a solution is based on the idea that what we do is to analyze the situation first of all, and then determine the functions of the objects that are present and how to use them in order to solve the problem. And what Duncker eventually came up with was the concept of what's called functional fixedness, which is defined simply as the inability to envision available objects performing whatever task is required in a given situation. And in that particular case, I mean, we know what the function of the buckets is, and what's really becoming fixed there is the idea of taking the biggest bucket and pouring it once and then 2 times, and supposedly that's going to give you an answer. And all of a sudden it's arranged in such a way that that doesn't give you an answer. And the interesting thing is then what happens? What goes on in the minds of subjects, and how is that displayed in the behavior that they exhibit? And oftentimes it becomes a very frustrating kind of experience, and they get, particularly if you put time and accuracy pressure on them, what happens is they become even more flustered, and the net result is that they're not really processing the information as they should be. Because obviously if you look at that, it's very easy to get 25 gallons when you've got a 28 and a 3 bucket gallon. You don't even have to use the 3rd bucket, but that 3rd bucket becomes essentially a confusing element in that kind of a situation. Simmel, in 1953, developed a rather interesting illustration of a related kind of problem, and that is, he posed the following kind of a situation. Suppose that you're given 8 coins, and the particular thing that you have to find is the following. The problem is basically that you've got 3 stacks of, you've got 8 coins, one of which weighs less but looks identical. It is, however, a counterfeit. And your problem is to try to find the counterfeit in that situation. And the net result is that we have a problem because, although we have a scale available to us, we can only use it twice. Maybe what you have to pay to use the scale is more than the value of some of the coins. So if you use it more than twice, you've defeated the whole purpose of trying to identify where's the lemon among the 7 genuine pieces of fruit. So how do we do it? The most obvious kind of solution, of course, is to, well, okay, let's take those 8 coins and divide it into 2 stacks of 4. The problem is that that won't work. Because, yes, you could weigh those, and maybe one of the 2 stacks will be lighter, but you're then faced with having to weigh both stacks to end up creating, to identify the still light coin. And yes, if you took the 2 in each side and split it, you could get it down to one of these 2 coins as too light, but you've already used both weighings. So it is clear that dividing the 8 into 2 stacks isn't going to solve the problem. So then at some point, something occurs to people, and that is, well, look, wait a minute, let's do it this way. Let's actually divide it into 3 stacks, and we'll make it 2 stacks of 3 coins and 1 stack of 2 coins. Theoretically, we can immediately eliminate 2 stacks under one particular premise, and that is, if we take our scale, is that a grand scale or what? We're going to balance the 2 and put them on there, and if they balance, we can throw away all 6, or not throw away, but we know those don't include the counterfeit, and then it's easy. Because at that point, we simply take the 2 that remain and weigh them, and if it tips this way, we've identified the counterfeit coin, and we've done it in only 2 weighings. So by dividing into 3, 3, and 2, in the best of circumstances, you've got it solved directly this way. Dealing with the 3, let's suppose instead that what happens is that you end up with you weigh the 2 stacks of 3 coins each, and this happens. Now you've got a problem, theoretically, because yes, we know which stack contains the coin, but what are we going to do? Because now we've got to have 3 coins that we separate. Well, recursion. Remember we talked about recursion in these kind of problems. Can you apply the same problem again? And the answer is yes. You take just that stack of 3, and now we're going to take that stack and divide it as we did the original stack. That is, we're going to put it this way. And so in this particular situation, this is only our 2nd weighing. And in this case, if the stacks of 3 are uneven either way, you can then take the one that is lighter and weigh all 3 of those, 2 of them being weighed and 1 not. And obviously in this situation, if it balances, then the one that is off the scale is the lightest. And if it tips either direction, then you've identified the higher of the 2 being the counterfeit in the particular situation. So in this particular instance, it was actually the offloaded coin that became the correct one in that situation. So in essence, you're seeing again the existence of an element of functional fixedness, in that it really takes some creativity to break free of just weighing even quantities and looking for the light. You have to do more than that. You have to apply a little logic beforehand to set up the premise on which you're going to weigh not all of the coins. And so basically, what we're left with here is some rather interesting proposals in terms of various types of thinking that can be used to avoid functional fixedness. That is, one of the problems becomes how do we actually describe what's going on in that situation and seek to avoid functional fixedness. Dunker actually identified 2 different types of thinking that would work in this particular situation. And he engaged, first of all, or identified what he called analytic thinking. In this case, what happens is that you manipulate the object in order to reach conclusions. So in this case, if you're trying to answer a very simple question like, what color is an orange? Then you process by assuming that, okay, an orange has skin, and the skin is orange. And thus, if a skin is part of an orange, the answer to that particular problem is going to be that the orange is orange in color. There's a semantic mix there between the name of the fruit and the color that it exhibits, which is confusing, but in essence, in this kind of analytic thinking, the point that's being made essentially is that there is nothing in the conclusion that wasn't in the premises that you started with. That is, you had the answers available to you when you started the manipulation, and it's just a matter of combining it in such a way in more complex problems so that you can actually derive the correct answer to this kind of a problem. The other kind of thinking that Dunker talked about is what he identified as synthetic thinking. There, what you do is to essentially to construct mental objects, and you use them to reach particular conclusions. You've seen problems like this before, but let's assume that we've got 3 people of varying height, and I'm going to tell you various things about these people, and we're going to compare them on level ground. This is ground. It's abstract, but what I did was to water it a little bit and create some grass for you to convince you that in fact we are outside on level ground. That's what we're working with here. And so we're going to start with Alan. Alan is here. That looks obscene. Well, look, let's do this. We'll pants him, then it's okay. Alan, we know, is taller than Richard. That's premise 1. Alan is taller than Richard. We have a second person who is also involved, and that is a person by the name of Frank. Well, I'm sorry, I should say a third person. And we know about them that Richard is taller than Frank. Premise 2. The question then is Alan taller than Frank? Since we have not been able so far to make a direct comparison of that. We've got 2 relational statements, and does that in fact lead to the conclusion that Alan is in fact taller? But in this particular instance, we can rank order. Given that we know those relations among the 3 that are involved, we can indicate simply that Alan is the tallest, Richard is in the middle, and Frank is the shortest, and from that we can deduce that Alan is in fact taller than Frank. Okay? Now that's an example of synthetic thinking. The conclusion was not contained in the premises, but after construction, it could be derived. Now, it obviously has been kept simple in that particular situation. That's pretty much an interocular impact effect. The answer to that one knocks you between the eyes. But the more general premise here is that you get more out of that situation than you put into it. That is by arranging a model of the order of the height of the individuals that were involved there. Insight is basically achieved when simple parts are combined to form a new whole. That's a gestalt analysis that Dunker endorsed endorsed as kind of explaining the work that he had done there. But in essence, his example of synthetic thinking, though simple, makes a legitimate point, and that is that taking the givens, you can then arrange certain logical consistencies in how the model looks, and from that you can directly extract the answer that you may need depending on the nature of the particular problem. So you get more out of it than you put into it. Which leads to one of my all-time favorite problems as another example. Weisberg and Alba in 1981 originally proposed what is known as the 9 dots problem, which is a real bugaboo under certain conditions. But the particular situation here is the challenge. That's the given. The challenge is, can you connect these 9 dots with 4 straight lines without taking your pencil off the paper once you start drawing? Okay? How many of you, by show of hands in the room here, know the answer for sure to this particular problem? I do use it in intro, so if you've paid attention, you might have seen this earlier, but it's an interesting problem. Okay, so we can put our pencil, we can start anywhere on the paper that we want, and we can draw in any direction that we want. The only limit was basically that you can only have 4 straight lines in which to cover those 9 dots. Now I'm going to arbitrarily start, we could start in the middle if you want, but for obvious reasons we're going to start on the corner. And the question then is, are we going to draw outside the box? No rule said you couldn't. We're going to draw to the left? Do we want to draw vertically? Or do we want to draw diagonally, starting from the corner box? Obviously, abstractly, there are only 2 positions to start in this, either on a corner dot or on a center dot. So I'm going to start with the corner dot and see. So among those, it turns out that the correct solution is to start this way. And so to solve this problem, what we do is to go this far. We've knocked out 3 out of 9 already. And now you've only got 2 directions you can turn unless you want to waste time recovering your path. So you're either going to turn right or you're going to turn left. Intellectually, theoretically, it doesn't matter which way you turn. Given that I can only do a limited amount with the PowerPoint, I turned left. So once we got to dot 3, I'm now going to take a left turn, and here is the solution to the problem. I don't know whether I've mentioned this earlier in class, but I taught this one time at another school in town here in a summer school class in the evening, and it just happened the way the lecture fell out that semester. I hit this problem right at the beginning of a 3-hour lecture on a Monday evening. Okay, we were going to be there from 6:30 to 9:30, and some poor lady sat there with a legal pad, 8.5 by 14, and she started in the upper corner doing very nice 9-dot problems, okay, patterns. And she was doodling with it. She tried it left and right and back and forth. She went through 4.5 pages of legal pad paper during the course of 3 hours of that lecture, and not once did she solve the problem. Because in that case, I teased them at the beginning and said, I'll show you at the end if you haven't worked it out by then, because we had 2 breaks coming, so I thought they might play with it a little bit. By the end of the lecture at 3 hours, she was not doing the dots this way. She was doing them this way. Bam, bam, bam. And the problem was that what she had done was to illustrate functional fixedness, because she wrote a rule which many people write when the problem is posed that makes it impossible to solve the problem. Because it is so nice and bound, you think of that in those 9 dots as defining a square, and you simply don't think outside the box. This is likely the problem from where that statement originally came. To solve this problem, you literally do have to think outside the box. And it is often used as a starting point in corporate seminars on creative thinking and problem solving. Because in this case, all I said was 9 dots, 4 lines without removing your pencil from the paper once you start drawing. Didn't say anything about where you could draw. And many people look at that and simply write a rule for themselves, which I didn't say, that you have to stay within the limits. And as soon as you do that, you make the problem unsolvable. Okay? Now, you could cheat and use lines that are 5 feet wide, and yeah, you could do it in 4 lines, but that's not the point of the problem. In a mathematical sense, an infinitely small dot and an infinitely thin line. But you can still do it. And the rest of the solution then, once you've seen this, the rest is easy. Because now what you're going to do is take a sharp left turn again and go across the diagonal dots to over here, and then 1 more sharp turn, and we're home. So, 4 lines, 9 dots connected without taking our pencil off the paper once that happens. This kind of an effort has led to some rather interesting kinds of thinking, and in essence what it boils down to is that we have to change the meaning and the organization that may occur quite suddenly in the thoughts that we've attached to each of the elements of a problem that we're trying to solve. Ellen, or actually a bunch of different people, Weisberg started by arguing essentially that the gestalt view holds that once a problem is solved, and let me get ahead here in the group that I'm trying to identify here and talk specifically about, I'll get it there eventually, Weisberg. Weisberg and Ellen fought a good bit because Weisberg argued back in the mid-80s, and I'm quoting here directly, the Gestalt view holds that once fixation is broken, the solution either appears whole in a flash, we might call that an insight, or is produced smoothly as one step leads to another. And that is not, Ellen argues, what actually happens. She argued differently, using Meyer's classic string problem to illustrate her point. You will remember we talked about that the other day. I didn't get to demonstrate it here in studio, but the string problem is where you hang two strings far enough apart so that you can't grab one and stretch it to its limits and get the other. The problem is to tie the two strings together. So you link the strings, but they're hanging far enough apart you can't get all the way holding one to the other. And she used that basically to illustrate that changes in meaning and organization occur suddenly. That was her assertion. Okay? And so where Weisberg was arguing that it's all at once or smoothly, Ellen is arguing essentially that the changes are quite sudden when they occur. And in essence then what is being argued here is that when the changes occur suddenly, it's a predictable sequence that you go through. First of all, often what sets this off, this insight, is unexperienced or not consciously recognized. That is, you don't overtly appreciate, argues Ellen, when you are moving close to an insightful solution of a problem. It's just kind of aha, as the word is sometimes used to describe what's going on there. And this is basically not experienced. It isn't something experienced. It just happens. And so before the solution, there basically is confusion or disharmony. You don't have a clue what the solution actually is, and you've been grappling with all the different elements, and all of a sudden an aha occurs, insight arrives, and you solve it very suddenly. And it's described by people, and Ellen, as essentially you kind of experience having an idea, and the transformation or organization is not experienced in reasoning any more than a reversible perspective, an illusion, for instance, is experienced. Let me step aside here and illustrate for you what I'm actually talking about there, because that's a fairly fundamental point to what she's arguing, and that is that the experience of mastering the solution, she's arguing, is not something that we overtly experience. Take a look at these samples here. What do you see in the center of this diagram? How would you describe the center of this diagram? Okay, get on microphone and you even get credit for what you're saying there. What do you see in the center? How many of you see empty space? How many of you see something else? What's there? A triangle? Look carefully. There is no triangle there. Go ahead. Okay, that's a possibility, a Star of David, but the same basic answer still applies, and that is, it is not there either. But a triangle, an isosceles triangle base down, certainly is not there. There is not a white triangle in that diagram. Okay? What is there are three things that look like the old Pac-Man symbol and three angles, but that's all. That's all that's there. And they happen to interrupt in such a way, that's exactly the pattern you would see if you laid a white triangle on top of three solid black circles and an outline of an isosceles triangle point down. But the fact is that white triangle is not there. You're exhibiting closure and a very healthy imagination to put it in there, because it isn't actually there. All of the other figures act as if, or are interrupted in such a way as to imply that that white triangle is there, but it simply isn't. It's not there. Or this one. You see objects here? You're looking just at random objects in this particular situation. I should have introduced that before actually showing you, but if you look very closely, there is a word actually that shows up there. Let me back up one to show you that. Okay? But if you, I had it in my notes and I blew right through that as I knew I would. I should have set it up more directly as just random blocks from which something might emerge. But in that case, it's a little hard to pick out because the emphasis is not on the letters outline as it is here, but rather on the shapes themselves, which more dominate that figure. Or then one that will run you crazy if you spend too long on it, the reversible box. Which way are we looking at this box? Or let's even apply it specifically in this situation, another one that is a standard bugaboo for people. Are you in a balcony looking down on the top of this staircase, or are you down in the cellar looking up underneath it? So this is the staircase illusion. It's an either-or, it's a figure ground illusion. And in one case, we can imagine ourselves upstairs looking down on it so that the gray there is the top of the stairs. And you can watch somebody climb down those particular stairs. But we can isolate that and then set it up again as downstairs looking up underneath the stairs. And in that case, it's descending to the right. Okay? And you're now underneath in the cellar looking up at the underside of the staircase there. Can you force it back and forth? That one for me is one of the toughest ones to get to flip. But if you concentrate on it, you can get it to go either way. Okay? But think about it as you're doing that and do some metacognition on the process that you're experiencing. You do not directly all of a sudden say to yourself, oh wait, I'm downstairs, so that means that angle is, and so forth. That's what Ellen is talking about. She's talking about the fact that the insight in solving a problem is not directly experienced. It happens and it occurs, but you just all of a sudden re-perceive things in a very different way in this kind of a situation. And so basically, this became the direct comparison basis for a study by Metcalfe and Wiebe, I should say, W-I-B-E, in 1987, who countered the two that had been arguing and raised problems about the idea that really, when you solve problems, they can be envisioned as either being solved with insight or those that can be solved without insight in a more progressive way. And so in essence, what he did was to argue that those without insight, problems that are solved without insight, basically display a stepwise progression. That's the kind of thing you do in algebra class when you're given a problem trying to reach a particular solution, and if you know you understand the basic principles of algebra, you then just proceed through those rules, applying each one to move progressively from the confusion, the unknown, to identifying how to solve the particular problem. And in essence, that kind of algebra, being a good example, generates a stepwise solution. You just move progressively, line by line, from what you start with to the goal that you need in that situation. And in most instances, if you think about it, a good algebra student can verbalize what he or she is doing in solving that problem. That is, it is literally a progressive, stepwise solution that is being exhibited there, and they will exhibit some degree of sense of excitement or warmth, if you want to think about that, comfort with the fact that, yeah, I'm headed in the right direction. I, of course, also had the opposite experience many times in class, where partway through an exam, I just had to tear it all up and start over again, because there was no warmth at all in what I was doing. But that warmth, I think you can recognize from a couple of the grins in the room here, is something that you do appreciate when you're in a stepwise kind of math problem solving situation there. What Metcalfe and Wiebe did was to create a problem that could be solved in any of several different ways problems, some of which could be solved without insight and some of which could be not. And then they plotted the results that they got in the following way. What they're going to show us basically is the time to solution, just arbitrarily divided in fifths there, and the rated warmth on the part of the subject asked at various times through the problem solving set to basically rate how warm they felt, how confident they felt that they were getting close to the solution. And if you plot then in terms of with insight problems that can be solved with insight and those that are solved without insight, if you look at what happens to ratings of warmth when it's a non-insight problem, when it's a progressive steps problem, this is what tends to happen, and this is an average across many subjects, but this is what happens to the ratings of warmth. There is a steady increase in the rated warmth, or confidence, if you want to think about it that way, of how soon the problem is going to be solved. And it also showed increasing rated warmth as they approached the solution. But on the other hand, for insight problems, look at the substantial difference in the way the data is generated. In this case, what happens is that across the steps, the total time involved in solving the problem, a substantial way through the problem, you're getting no anticipatory warmth at all. It goes from I don't know where I am, oh my goodness, that's it. And in that case, with solving a problem where insight is involved, tends to lead to a very different kind of progression in terms of the warmth that is actually involved in this case. So these judgments are basically an example of metacognition. That is, we're thinking about our problem solving toward resolving whatever particular problem has been posed to us in that situation. And we're dealing with a feeling of knowing, or it was described by these researchers as warmth, the sense of how confident am I that I'm getting close to being able to solve the particular problem. They do not occur with respect to insight problems, because insight problems are conceptualized essentially as something you do not plan. It happens. Insight itself is a sudden onset of realization. Oh, that's how it works. Okay? And in essence, this led to another very interesting kind of research done, among others, samples by Lockhart, Lemon, and Gick in the late 1980s, in which they studied another source of difficulty that problem solvers can have in this kind of a situation. And that is basically the situation where you have a failure to be able to identify key insight problems, okay? Inability to detect missing information. Let me pose a problem to you, okay? This is it, from the Houston Chronicle. A man married 3 different women in a small town, in Houston actually, in a large town. All of them are still living. They all know each other and him. And yet he has never had to divorce any of them. And the question is why? Anybody know the solution to that particular problem by show of hands? Okay. The other 90% are totally buffaloed. That's an example of a problem that will be solved with insight. It'll be an all or none solution. I'll even give you a hint. Church. I'll give you another hint. Clergy. I'll give you the answer. The person who married the women is a clergyman, a priest. So he marries an average of 3 women a week, and he's never had to divorce any of them. Ah, shoot. But the missing fact there is the fact that you've misread married as he being one of the 2 active parties. He marries couples. Okay? And so in that situation, it can be described exactly as the newspaper article does there. A man has married many women. He's not had to divorce one of them, and he knows all of them in the same town. And so basically, the kind of issue that we get into here is one that actually goes way back in the history of psychology, and that is to the issue of what is called sagacity. It was actually James, over 100 years ago now, who originally introduced the idea of sagacity. And we're going to define that sagacity as essentially the ability to discover what is essential about a situation. Obviously, in this case, we had an absence of sagacity in terms of figuring out what was the relevant feature of that story, which was true. There's a second way to actually define this, which puts a slightly different nuance on it, and that is to talk about it instead as the ability to see into a situation and discriminate its important aspects. In that story of the man who married 3 women, the obvious relevant missing data has to do with the nature of the occupation of the man. And so at some point in thinking about it, doubtless you would get around to realizing that, well, now wait a minute, given the specific wording, what are some options that would develop in this case? But this concept of sagacity actually goes all the way back to William James and functionalism, almost 120 years ago now. And this has in turn led to some questions about how do we go about encouraging or implementing sagacity. What can we do in a given problem-solving situation in order to facilitate the problem solver's task in this situation? And in essence, what this leads to then is studies about the way to implant sagacity, or the ability to see or ask the critical question. Lockhart and others actually studied the ways to implant sagacity, and what they did was basically to manipulate hints in one of two ways. We're going to show you an object on the desk here in just a minute, but the simplest way to implant a hint about that, for instance, the man who married 3 women problem, is to make a statement earlier on in the description of the problem to the effect of something like a declarative sentence like, it made the clergyman happy to marry several women a week. Now that is even more direct than a less direct clue that would still be declarative. It made the clergyman happy to marry several couples a week, because that doesn't even put the direct emphasis on women, which was the source of the difficulty in that particular problem. That, in essence, is doing it declaratively. The other way to do it is to do it essentially in what we might call a puzzle and card situation. The puzzle is on one side of a card. The man married several women each week because it made him happy. And the answer is on the other side. Flip side has the word clergyman on it. And thus the problem and solution are on opposite sides of the card. What's hypothesized in this situation is that the puzzle format, and this reaches back a number of lectures in terms of what we've talked about here. But in essence, what we would suspect in this case is that if you think back to levels of processing, as we talked about that in how it impacts learning and memory, in essence, if we give you the puzzle or the hint in the form of something that encourages deeper thinking, what that does is to force you down to deeper levels of processing, more interaction with the overall concept. And that became one of the foci of the work by Lockhart and colleagues. Essentially, what they ended up concluding is that the declarative format doesn't really facilitate sagacity. If we simply make a statement to you that doesn't force you to think about the material, it doesn't play as much of a significant role in getting you to reconceptualize when you face a problem with any particular set of material. And so in essence, the other format, it was hypothesized that the puzzle format would lead subjects to process information in a manner that would facilitate problem solving. As an example, children were handed a toy such as you see on the desk here. And in essence, it could be declared, it could be presented to them in either of two ways. They could essentially be told, this is a cat's toy, period. Or it could be presented as, this might be a cat's toy. And the might be is what is considered to be a conditional development, a conditional introduction of the toy or the object. In that case, it could be a cat's toy, but it isn't simply saying this is a cat's toy, which is kind of, this is it, here's what it is, period. No thinking required. Oh, that's a cat's toy. But on the other hand, if we call it essentially a conditional statement, this might be a cat's toy, that is done in such a way as to encourage other possibilities of thinking. Well, what on earth might we also use that for? And that in turn leads to the greater depth of processing, which ultimately becomes desirable in problem solving. So in essence then, let's pop to another issue on the screen, and we'll look at then another problem, and that has to do with rigidity. Rigidity is kind of a fancy word for functional fixedness, but it's one attribute of what contributes to functional fixedness. The Lucan's water jar problems illustrate this particular difficulty, encroaching rigidity and its adverse effects. The problems early on, as you remember, can be solved very simply. B minus A minus 2C. The big bucket poured into the other bucket once, and each bucket once, and one of the buckets twice, and the whole thing is solved. Deliberately set up in that was the idea that what subjects are encouraged to do is to develop a set. Gee, I've got this problem solved. It's easy. A minus B minus 2C, period. And what that does is to create what is referred to in the literature simply as a set, or the German word for that is Einstellung, which you will sometimes see used. It refers to the same thing. But in essence, this is the gestaltists called it Einstellung, but set is the concept in English that we're talking about. And what that refers to essentially is a specific manner of responding to a particular problem, where the particular word that is relevant there is specific. If you don't have a fluid response, you are going to hang yourself when all of a sudden the rules change, as they do in the Lucan's water jar problem. And so in essence then the last problem and the goal of simply X in that case was solved by simply a big bucket poured into one smaller bucket, and that was a direct solution. The Lucanses, there were two of them doing the research, actually tested something over 5,000 subjects in that particular pouring of water into jugs problem. And they found that there were two things that increased the likelihood that rigidity would work into a person's problem-solving procedure. And that is, first of all, if they increase the pressure to perform quickly. Pressure to perform rapidly increased the likelihood of rigidity. Now, the good part is that led to a more rapid solution of A minus B minus 2C solves the problem. But the adverse effect was that if we also pressured for accuracy, that is, it's very important that you do this accurately, and if we added pressures for accuracy, the same thing also happened. There tended to be much greater rigidity, so that once they developed that B minus A minus 2C, I was misspeaking on that formula, they tended to rigidly apply that when they got to a situation where other combinations involving only two buckets would lead to a more rapid solution. And so what the Lucans were able to demonstrate essentially is that either pressures to perform more rapidly or pressures to perform with greater accuracy, either can produce a greater likelihood toward functional fixedness and rigidity. Langer conceptualized this flexibility rigidity, that's hard to say, the flexibility rigidity dimension in terms of another related concept, and that has to do with what is called mindfulness versus mindlessness. Okay? And so what she was arguing essentially was that flexibility is to rigidity as mindfulness is to mindlessness. And when we talk about mindless, what we're talking about in this situation is essentially someone who acts as if a situation has one possible solution. Obviously, it's a variation on functional fixedness or rigidity. We can define it either of two ways in that situation. Mindlessness is the issue that's involved there. Alternatively, being mindful in this situation is a different cast. In this case, what we're looking at is someone who is sensitive to, open to other possibilities in the situation there. And Langer and Piper then followed up this work, or anticipated actually, with a different study in which they described the toy as I was talking about it a minute ago. That is, introducing a toy declaratively, this is a cat's chew toy, or conditionally, this could be a cat's chew toy, led to a very interesting solution or difference in solution to a particular problem. Because in the context of having casually introduced a particular toy, either declaratively, that's what its purpose is, or conditionally, this is one of the things it could be used for. Later on in the blackboard in the lab, or at the blackboard in the lab, the researcher needed an eraser. They'd been diagramming furiously on the board, which was all part of the experiment. And all of a sudden they reached the point where the board was full and they had a new concept they wanted to introduce. You've seen college instructors go through that all the time. Well, in essence, what they found was that the kids who were in there observing what was going on were much more likely to suggest the toy as an eraser, because the material nature of the toy that we're showing here was such that it could very easily be used as an eraser. It would simply soak up the chalk dust. So that a mindful response is much more likely following conditional introductions and considerations of the toy. Those who'd been given a mindful introduction, could be a cat's chew toy, was much more likely to lead someone introduced to the toy that way, suggesting you could use it to erase the blackboard in this situation. So the conclusion is that basically responding mindfully in a given situation, responding conditionally, I should say, to new concepts and occurrences is a key predecessor to mindfulness. That's the key that you really need to do. To reduce rigidity, respond to things in a mindful way, conditionally, essentially. Unconditional description can be very efficient. It's much easier to say, that's a cat's toy. But if you want to have somebody be flexible about other possible uses, it's better to introduce it simply in a conditional manner. Now, all of this work on functional fixedness and related processes has led to some rather interesting work. One of the grandparents of the area, and one who's contributed significantly to it in a very constructive way, is a gentleman by the name of Polya. I've never been sure how to pronounce his name, but in essence, the book that I'm referring to here is a classic in the field. It's a famous book called How to Solve It, and it's basically a book of problem-solving strategies. How do you go about solving the particular problem that is at hand? And what he talks about in that book is what is called heuristic problem-solving. Remember, we talked once before about heuristics, and I promised that we would get back to it at some later time. Well, here we are. We're going to talk about it now. And there are two different concepts that I'm going to develop for you here. One of them is a heuristic, or let me talk about heuristics specifically. One of the terms I want to define for you is heuristic. And a heuristic is basically a strategy, often but not always helpful, in solving a problem. So it's a general approach, I guess we might talk about it, or you could even think of it, envision it essentially as a partial set of rules. Not a complete set, but a partial set of rules. Contrast that, the obverse here is an algorithm. An algorithm, as you can see, is defined much more precisely. A set of rules that will solve a problem if correctly followed. Much more direct, but potentially much more time-consuming. If you think about it, the way you and I solve most problems is using heuristics. Okay? When I commute to the University of Houston, I come in from the southwest corner of the Loop, Meyerland area. And so my normal strategy is in on the South Loop, north on 288, east on North McGregor, which will get me into the general region of the campus. This particular morning, as I got in the car, the first traffic report I heard indicated that there was a major accident at Holly Hall, which is between the South Loop and McGregor, where I get off 288. So I just decided that what I was going to do was turn in on Alameda Genoa, which parallels 288, one route closer to my way. So in terms of a parallelogram, I wasn't going up 288 and in. I simply turned earlier, went up Alameda Genoa, and then intersected North McGregor. The trick there is the algorithmic solution would be to drive a given distance and then listen to the police radio, and drive another distance and listen to the police radio, and essentially clear the path ahead of you. And of course that would work. I mean, if I drove a block and then listened for traffic impediments in the next block, we could do that, and it would get me to school without being hung up in a traffic jam. But you can very readily appreciate that is not the most efficient way to do it. And so, yeah, the algorithm would be drive a block, listen to the traffic report, drive a block, listen to the traffic report, and do that redundantly, and you'll eventually get here not having encountered any traffic. You'll be 2 days late, but at least you get here. But the heuristic is obviously the more efficient way that most of us use. So we kind of go along, and if we hear on the radio that we're going to have trouble on our usual route, once you learn the city, you've got a variety of alternate routes that are available to you, and so you will tend to use them. And again, the danger, if I had chosen Alameda, is that that's a local street rather than an interstate, and if that has an accident on it, there are even fewer ways to get around than if you're on an interstate. So there is ever that risk. But in general, that strategy, though not always, will usually get you home quicker, using the parallel routes option if you have to. That's the distinction then between a heuristic, which is a kind of a game plan, not using all the rules exhaustively, where experience can play in, as opposed to an algorithm, which is essentially an algebraic lock certain. If you follow all of the options, you will solve the problem. The question is one of efficiency, and so efficiency is how we choose between heuristic solutions as opposed to algorithmic solutions. If we outline Polya's book, I'll save you $40 and do it for you generically here. If we look at the solutions that he actually developed, then there are several elements to what he's going to propose. It's a 4-step plan in general that he is proposing for solving problems. The first thing that you have to do is to understand the problem. Okay? And so basically the problem has to be stated in such a way that allows you to start thinking about it. You first of all have to understand what is the issue I'm trying to solve here. You might diagram it, you might sketch it, you might put down on a sheet of paper all the things you know about the particular issue that you're trying to solve. That sometimes is what we do with algebra problems, for instance. We just play with it. We put it on the paper and we start running possible solutions in that situation. But you have to make sure that you understand the problem, point one. Mine, in terms of getting from home to school, was pretty direct, and all of us can identify with that because we all do that in one form or another in problem solving day by day. The second element of Polya's method is that what we then have to do is to devise a plan. We find a similar problem that we've solved in the past. We may brainstorm about it. That is, in fact, in Polya's strategy, that is the point at which companies sit down and brainstorm. Well, let's sit down and brainstorm on ways to possibly solve this particular situation. Get a group together and brainstorm on it. We can discuss it with others. If the problem is yours rather than the company's, you just pose it to other people. I'm faced with, you describe it briefly, and you say, what would you do? What can I do in this particular situation? Any of you who are in dating relationships where a complexity is turned up may go to a fellow friend and simply describe, this is my problem, what do you think I ought to do about it? Well, the usual good solution is send flowers. That's a generic solution. Is that, as an example, an algorithmic or a heuristic solution? When you have partner problems, sending flowers is an algorithmic or a heuristic solution? That's heuristic. Because if the thing you're debating about is she thinks you waste too much money, that's not going to solve your problem. See what I mean? Instead of dealing with the money, you send me flowers. Get out of here. But at some point, after you've looked at all the options, what you're going to end up having to do is to make a decision. You've got to essentially carry out, you've got to implement a plan of one sort or another. You have to make a decision about what you're going to do. And you have to, assuming you have developed a logic, you're then going to have to conduct it carefully and attend to the details, particularly if it's a complex, for instance, algebraic problem that you're trying to solve. So once you develop the strategy, after brainstorming and considering it and everything else, you're then going to have to eventually implement the plan. What makes Polya's a particularly interesting kind of handbook for solution, if you want to think about it that way, is the fact that step 4 is in some ways key to what he's really proposing here, and that is what he's also arguing is that once you've understood the problem, once you've devised a way to handle it, once you've implemented that plan, before you get done, what you then do is to examine the solution. Examine the solution. Was it adequate? Did it solve the problem? Was it efficient? Does it generalize to other kinds of problems that we might solve in the future using elements of this particular plan, and so forth? I don't always have time, but when I have TAs assisting me with the large introductory class, often at the end of the semester, time permitting, I will sit down and brainstorm with them what was the biggest problem we had this semester and how might we solve it next year? What would you do differently in running the class next time? In the letter that I send to people in the TV class, in the TV sections of this course, the tagline at the end is quite a serious one, and that is, if you have problems, let us know. Because the only way we can fix things and make it run smoother is to be aware of where the problems are and then brainstorm on how to potentially solve it. Some we can't, but most we can if we dedicated enough information to or enough thinking to it. So a key element of Polya's method is that step 4, examine the solution that you've come up with. And that's really what that's really doing is setting you up to be able to do the steps on the next plan a little bit more easily. Yeah, you still have to understand the problem, but when it comes time to devise a plan, if you've already filled your head with problems you've had in the past and the way it's been solved, you can typically generate a much more rapid list of ways in which to solve the problem. It's fun. I'm going to a convention this weekend, and one of the things that's always fun there is to go into teaching seminars and presentations where people are looking at problems and how they've solved them in class. Very seldom I come away from one of those without something new occurring to me, as in, gee, that was an ingenious way to get around that particular problem. I have a number of people that I have, you know it's operating here, but I have a number of people in the past who've grumbled about attendance. It's always a problem in lecture classes. And the solution that I've come up with years ago is, because I don't like to punish people, but I certainly do like to reward people, and that's just basic strategy. That's basic psychology. And the solution that I've come up with is that when attendance drops below a certain point, I give points to the students that are in class, which to me is the most beneficial way to do it, because it rewards people for doing what they ought to be doing anyway as part of their job as student, and it puts a positive spin on, I was there, I benefited, not only intellectually but in terms of points. And that solution is one that has not occurred to many other people. That is, I've posed that a number of times in these kind of sessions, such as I'll be going into this weekend, and it's a kind of an eyebrow raiser for people, because they've never really thought about it. It's easy. I don't have to take attendance. I don't have time in my life or any interest in seeing who's in which seat. But I can very quickly scan a room and tell whether it's below 85%. I've gotten to be pretty good at that. And so if it is, I'll give extra credit. So the solution is very easy, and the reward is there. It ultimately benefits the students, and it keeps them in the class, which was the goal anyway. That's an example of where the solution, the problem has been examined, handled, and then examined again. The solution's been examined, and in fact it has benefited positively my own teaching in subsequent years. So essentially this is the procedure that is used by those who have studied artificial intelligence. That's exactly the way the textbook that I use in Intro Psych, which is an all-electronic text, was developed. We looked at problems, and we actually had about an 8-year iterative process of this works, but here's the problem, and how do we solve it using the computer. And we've now got a very slick system. It's been a couple of years since we had any problems getting it onto student computers, but it's a gradual process of problem solving. What really enables that is step 4 in that method. When you have a problem and solve it, look at the solution. Is it on target? Is it efficient? Does it solve the problem you have? Does it cause you any other problems, which can sometimes happen? So in essence, what I think is the most valuable part of Polya's method is that step 4. Look at the solution once you have it and have implemented it, and see whether it actually does the job or whether there's a better way to do it. Give you an example. This is one of my favorite games. Have you ever played Gomoku? It was developed or talked about a lot by Benjafield in a recent Intro Psych text. And what he's dealing with there is a classic game. You'll probably be familiar with it once I put it on the screen here. But in essence, it's a game that involves a grid. And you can do the grid of any particular size that you want. The bigger it is, the longer it takes. So just to preserve your own time, it may be better to structure it to 7 by 7 or 8 by 8 or something like that. But in essence, the goal here is to create a string of, this is X and O. It's two people playing against each other from opposite sides of the board. But in essence, the goal there is to create 5 X's or O's in a row on a grid of some square dimension. And obviously, the bigger the square, the longer the game is going to take, but the more options that you have in that particular situation. So in essence, the best possible situation to be in this particular game is this one. Because if the X player has reached this point, and there are 4 O's on the board, not as carefully planned, but Mr. O or Ms. O has already lost this game. Because even if O has another move, he or she is still not going to be able to prevent the 4 X's from becoming 5. Okay? That's an example of what is called an open 4. That is, you've got a row of 4 X's, and it can be horizontal, vertical, or in this case, diagonal. It is an open 4 because it's not bound on any side, either by the other player's movement, a 0, or the edge of the board. That is, that wouldn't be as beneficial if it were 2 positions lower and 1 to the right, because then one end of it would be down in the bottom right corner of the board. You couldn't extend that by going further to the right and lower. And that's therefore what is called a closed 4. Okay, or a constricted 4. In that case, you would then have to, if you had next move, then you could still win. But if the other player has any sense and the next move, you're not going to be able to use that, because he or she will then put a 0 on the end of that. So as I said, the best position in this game is to have what is called an open 4, unimpeded by either the edge of the board or the other player's marks or anything else. The next best thing is to have 2 what are called open 3s. That is, if the zero player is working there, he's got one set of open threes along the bottom of the board there. He can go either direction. She can go either direction to extend that. But there is still the risk that by adding that fourth zero, you're going to call attention of the other player to it, and therefore you have the option of, or the possibility that you will clue them so that they will then go put the last X to blunt your activity in that situation. And in fact, we can look at all of the different options that, for instance, a computer could generate in this situation, and we can come up with a rank-ordered list of what would be the best options for either player to develop. Open 4, as we've got diagrammed there, 2 open 3s. There's only 1 open 3 on that board, but if you had another pair of open 3s somewhere else, you could potentially, that can be beneficial too, because it's a kind of a divide and conquer situation. Constricted 4 is third best. 2 constricted 3s are considered to be the fourth option, and so forth. You can extend on down. Some number of open 2s, and one of the sub-strategies, of course, is to try and get an open 2 developed somewhere on the left side of the board, and then only 1 or 2 steps away from it have an open 2 on the same line or the same column. So that all of a sudden you've developed 2 open 2s, and then bingo, by putting a mark in the middle, you've linked 2 open 2s into an open 5, and you've won in that situation. So depending on where they're oriented, different elements of the overall game can become most important or most desirable in solving the particular situation that is involved there. And so in the same way, I've talked only about offense, but in the same way, defensive moves can also be rank ordered. That is, we can simply look at, obviously, blocking a 4 is highest among the defensive maneuvers. One of the lessons in this is then that what you want to do is to essentially occupy the center of the board early on. Because if you do that, it limits the number of vertical and horizontal open 3s and 4s that can occur. The more stuff you can get in the center of the board, that's a kind of a grander strategy, and it's a defensive move, which doesn't necessarily rank order in a particular situation. But obviously, number 1 is blocking a 4 in whatever way you can do so as the number 1 defensive maneuver, destroying an open 3, because it immediately becomes a limited thing if you put a mark at one end of what a subject is doing. And a higher preference there would be to put a mark that both advances one of your strings and frustrates the player. I mean, that's in some ways the best move of all. It's advanced you and hurt the other player in terms of their likelihood of being able to move. But basically, for each move, a computer can assess all of the possible moves, and that with the highest strategy then is the one that will actually ultimately be made. In this particular instance, the Gomoku is a relatively easy game to program because the rules are fairly direct and fairly simple to spell out, and you can pretty easily rank order them in terms of declining importance, obviously from open 4 downward. So that basically when it comes time to program a game on computer, for instance Gomoku, it requires really 2 things. One is an ability to describe the data structure. You have to be able to describe, diagram the game's current status. That is, know where it is at any given time and understand the problem. That is, you have to be able to lay out what the moves are that will move you toward whatever the target goals are in a particular situation. And then the second thing that you also need comes right back to Polia's book a minute ago, and that is the ability to not just structure the data, but evaluate the function. That is, you have to evaluate each of the moves. So the 2 key elements there are basically to be able to structure the data, diagram the current status of the game, and know the rules by which to extend from there to where you're headed. And then secondly, be able to evaluate, test the options, create them, carry them out, and then evaluate what was the effect, good, bad, or indifferent, and store that information. You need to have a history of what works and what doesn't work in a given situation. So if we look overall at the problem space for the Gomoku problem, we end up with the idea very simply that Gomoku is very simple as a computer programming problem. But you compare that to chess, and chess is just an exploding complexity, basically. Okay, so the relative complexity of Gomoku is quite simple. But the complexity in comparison to chess is complex. It's very complex. Okay, the moves in general in chess have to be analyzed anywhere between 2 and 5 moves ahead. So you're not only thinking about, okay, I'm going to move this part to this place. What you've also got to do is to anticipate, what does that do to the board? How does it change the threat level of my opponent's each piece? And what is he or she most likely to do? So you're running 2 to 5 moves ahead. And the math on that is mind-boggling. If at any given point on a board there are 30 possible legal moves, do you have any idea how many possible moves that leads to? You know, you're looking at a board, you have 30 possible legal moves that you can make. In examining, you have 10 to the 15th possible moves that can be made at that point. 10 to the 15th possible sequence of moves that you can make. Okay? You begin to appreciate the complexity of what is involved in analyzing a game like chess. So it's one thing to say, understand it, and analyze. It's quite a different when you're dealing with a game like chess that has many different moves on many different pieces, and the compounds of what happens as a consequence of each move, because it's a constantly shifting board. One of the things that renders the Gomoku more simple is the fact that the board is fixed. Once a move has been made, it doesn't change. You can't shift it and move it somewhere else later. So, but the basic issue there is simply that chess becomes an impossibly difficult thing to examine, because what you end up leading into is what's referred to simply as combinatorial explosion, which I think is a very good way to describe exactly what happens if you start trying to look at what are other things that can happen when you start analyzing a particular move in chess. And so basically, what we're going to have to concede here is that using a computer is to a certain extent going to be governed by, or the usefulness of a computer is going to be governed by the complexity of the game that you're trying to diagram. You may have been aware that IBM, in the form of building various computers, has taken on as a corporate challenge over the years the ability to beat a chess player, beat a world-class chess champion at his or her own game. And it has been a long battle. But the first victory finally occurred in the early 2000s. And it's been about a 40-year battle going on between the computer doing the best it can and then making a suggested move versus what the player actually did in that situation. It is simply not possible for a given human to analyze all of the possible moves. And so there's a case where experience really helps. Somebody that has a knowledge of what particular solutions have led to which kind of problems tends to be very valuable in that kind of a situation. So the heuristic versus the algorithmic approach is very important to understand. It has to be a heuristic strategy that you ultimately use there. Now, this in turn, this whole strategy of what are problems and what are the problems in solving problems, eventually led Herbert Simon and colleagues to develop what at first was just a ridiculously simple computer solution strategy. And that programming came to be known as the general problem solver, or GPS, as it's generally referred to in the literature. And it has tackled a number of different problems, but it operated initially on what's called a tote circuit. Test, operate, test, exit was all it was doing. It was testing and then operating on the field and then testing again to see what had been accomplished and how close it was to whatever the goal was in that particular situation. Let's go back and look at a game that I ended a program in confusion with. I ended it, but it was confusing, a couple of lectures back, and that is the Tower of Hanoi problem that we looked at once before. This is a particularly interesting problem because the rules are very easy to describe, but solving it can get to be fairly complex, and yet there is a minimal, efficient structure that can be used in solving a particular problem in this issue. You will remember here that what this involves are 3 coins of different, or 3 discs. It doesn't really matter whether they're coins, although you can do it easily with a dime, a nickel, and a quarter just on your desktop. But in essence, what we're trying to do is to move all 3 coins from the left stake to the right. And the limiting rule there is that you can move 1 ring at a time, first of all, and secondly, on any stake, you have to move 1 ring at a time, 1 stake at a time, and any stake you move a ring onto cannot have a smaller ring on it. That is, in no case can you have a large ring stacked on top of a small ring. That's what really causes the biggest problem. And so in essence, when you look at solving it, I'm going to go back and give you a diagram solution to what I did just by waving my hands over the table here a couple of tapes back. And in essence, what we're doing here, I'm going to diagram it 2 moves at a time. So what I'm going to do here, first of all, is to move the top ring, the smallest, to the furthest one. So center and then to the right. And then I'm going to move the middle-sized ring to the middle pole. Okay? And at this point, then, the next thing is going to be that I move the smallest over to the left, and then the middle one is moved to the right, which produces this as a solution. And now what I'm going to do is to move the smaller one over to the right and then the big one to the middle. We have already now achieved a recursive function, which we can then simply repeat as needed, except we're now also going to include a backup feature. So the next 2 moves then are to move the smallest one over to the left and the middle one to the middle. And in this case, then, the next move, again, is to move the small one to the right, first to the middle and then to the right, and then the middle one to the left. And finally, then, we're almost there, as you can likely anticipate. What we're now going to do is to move the small one further to the left, and the big one now goes to the right. And then we put the small one to the far side, the middle size to the middle stake. Then we move the small one over the left, the middle one to the right, and then bring the small one home, and we've solved the problem. Now, there is, I found on the internet, an area that you may want to go visit, and I'll leave this on the screen here for a minute, but there is a website that actually has that problem on it. So if you want to go visit this, and this is being done in early 2007, so I don't know how long it will remain active, but it's good enough that I suspect it's gotten enough positive press that it will probably be available in future years. But if you want to go check that site out, when you enter it, you get to identify who you are, and then you are challenged to move. You get to identify which ring you want to use and which pole you want to put it on. And you are then allowed to simply solve the problem. And you can create as many rings, as many poles as you want. You want to spend hours, create a bunch of poles, and have a deep stack of rings. But the same basic recursiveness works. And it's just a matter of applying it systematically in this situation. What makes this a particularly interesting site is that what it does after you're all done is it grades how efficient you were. So after you get all done, it will jump right back at you with 40% efficiency. It gives you a grade from 0 to 100 on how well you did, and it tells you exactly how many wrong moves you made. So you can go over and try to, I mean, you can waste a lot of your life on this if you want to, but it is an illustration of the Tower of Hanoi problem. Now, in essence, if we watch the general problem solver try to solve this particular problem, what it's going to do is to generate a search tree that shows all possible moves. And if you go back and think about the problem in its initial state, you had only 2 possible moves that you could make. You could take the small ring and move it to the center or to the right, period. Those were the only 2 possible moves. Once that's happened, you can then move the middle ring to the middle or to the right. The right is an illegal move, so it has to be then you've only got one legal option at that point, moving the middle ring to the middle stake. And then you've got rings in all 3 situations, which means then you've got only 2 possible moves at that point, small to the middle or small to the left. I guess you could do the middle to the left, but that's recursive, redundant, and it's not particularly valuable in that situation. So in essence, what you have to do is to search for all of the possible moves and set that up in a logical structure, which you can then examine. And that is essentially what a computer does. You move, in that case, from the start, you're going to move the small to the middle and then to the right. And then you can move the middle to the middle size ring to the middle stake, and so forth. But the easiest, basically, here is to create what's called a sub-goal. And that is going to be move small and medium to middle. So we do that as a sub-goal. The first thing we're going to do is get the sub-goal that we have. That's closer to what we want. We've got some of it stacked correctly, move closer to where it all needs to end up. And we achieve that simply by small to right, middle to medium to middle, and small to middle. And then we move the biggest from the left to the right as we are progressing. And so in essence, what a computer is going to do here is create various sub-goals, move small and middle to the right, which is a sub-goal, which we were at one point in solving it then, and again in solving it earlier. And then again, that can be achieved by a series of sub-steps. And that's basically the strategy that Simon used in developing this. What he did was to develop a very simple notation strategy of the following kind. That is, he established let condition equal C and let action equal A is where he started. And a production rule then would be essentially something like condition C leads to action A. C leads to A in that kind of situation. The goal production rule is essentially problem solved equals halt. That's at the end of the situation. So the problem is solved when there's no difference between the current state and the goal state. So at a point where you test what you've got relative to what you want, when those two are equal, the computer has solved the problem, and that's when it has the stop rule. What was being used here is something we've already talked about, and that is essentially a means-end analysis. So we're doing a repetitive analysis of the difference between the current state and the desired end state. What this will yield for us is what is referred to in that means-end analysis as a sub-goal. We check the difference between current and goal, and what that ultimately leads to is the point that I was trying to get to here, and that is what's called a goal stack. That is, in terms of the rules that are involved, at the bottom is the goal state. We want biggest, then middle, then smallest in the rightmost state. So that's our end state. That's what we're always comparing to in terms of how close are we to the solution we need. Above it is a goal that you can get to from the goal state. So in fact, if we start with the small, middle, largest on the rightmost stake, one that we could get to from that is the middle in the middle and the smallest on the right, and so forth. So we can solve this problem from both directions. If we know the start state and we know the end state, we can then build a stack that will ultimately solve the particular problem for us. All the way up the stack to the initial goal, moving from initial state to some intermediate sub-goal. Okay? And that becomes essentially our goal stack. The system simply searches for legal moves that will get it closer and closer to the goal state. That's the way the general problem solver actually works. And it was developed, interestingly enough, by a very simple process, and that is studying thinking aloud. In one case, what they studied is what's called concurrent verbalization of information. This obviously relies heavily on working memory. So in this case, what the person is doing as they try to solve that, for instance, Tower of Hanoi, is they're verbalizing as they do it. And by analyzing a running stream of that, they can eventually create a stack of rules that will lead from that start state to that goal state. The other possibility is to study it in terms of what's called retrospective verbalization. That is an after-the-fact summary of cognitive processes. This obviously relies on long-term storage as the key element. But it basically provides a description of the solution process, and that is referred to essentially as a protocol. That is the final goal. That is a statement of rules that will lead from whatever we started with to whatever we finished with. And the phrases then are just descriptions of individual single acts. We can create a problem-solving graph that is a grid of the various movements. That is actually included. One of those is included for the Tower of Hanoi problem in the website that I cited for you. We use it as a basis, summarized across many subjects, and it leads us to the general problem solver. Somebody has